wasn't looking for missing workers, but then I found the employment ledgers. Some of the documents you find from construction sites in the period that show crew rosters, they appeared in municipal archives marked as complete. Nothing suggested deliberate gaps, but something about them refused to settle. Names would appear for weeks, sign daily timesheets, then vanish mid-project without termination papers, final payment records, or forwarding addresses. They were excavation crews, foundation diggers, basement workers engaged in earth-moving operations. And according to the official record, they simply stopped existing. It began with a single ledger from a theater foundation project in San Francisco, 1856. The document had survived in a collection donated by the descendants of a construction foreman, tucked between receipts for materials and correspondence about weather delays. The ledger showed 12 men employed for foundation excavation, beginning March 18th. Daily entries tracked their hours, noted equipment use, documented progress through rock and soil. Then on April 2nd, the entries changed. 5 names disappeared from the roster. No notation explaining their absence. No final wages calculated. The remaining 7 workers continued logging hours as if nothing had occurred. But the handwriting shifted. The entries became briefer, and references to depths and materials ceased entirely. I started cross-referencing similar construction projects. Melbourne, Irkutsk, Buenos Aires, Sacramento, Montreal. Each city told the same story. Foundation crews would begin excavation, encounter materials that shouldn't exist at that depth, and within days, the crew roster would show gaps. Not terminations, not transfers. Gaps. The pattern appeared first in the timing. Projects would proceed normally for weeks, excavation advancing through soil and clay at expected rates. Then foreman logs would note an obstruction, a change in material composition, something requiring investigation. Within 48 to 72 hours, workers would vanish from the payroll. Some records showed partial crews remaining. Others showed complete replacement with workers who had no prior employment history in the region. The new crews would complete the foundation work in a fraction of the time the original excavation had required, despite supposedly encountering the same materials. We're told these cities were built on empty land, virgin territory waiting for civilization. The official histories describe tent settlements becoming permanent structures, wooden buildings replaced by brick and stone. Infrastructure emerging from collective effort and entrepreneurial determination. But the foreman logs describe something else. They describe worked stone at depths where no previous construction should exist. Ceramic drainage systems found 14 feet below ground level in cities supposedly founded on empty plains. Metal fixtures showing wear patterns from decades of use. Discovered during excavation for buildings, meant to be the first permanent structures on the site. Let's examine what we're told about Melbourne. The city's establishment is dated to 1835, a surveyed settlement on the Yarra River. By 1854, construction began on the Princess Theatre, one of several grand performance halls built during the Gold Rush prosperity. The foundation excavation was contracted to a crew of 23 workers, primarily immigrants with construction experience from European cities. The project foreman, whose daily logs survived in a private collection, documented standard progress for the first week, soil composition, drainage concerns, bedrock projections based on test shafts. On day 8, the entry changed. Encountered brick-lined passage running north-south at 16 feet depth. Construction appears deliberate, mortarless fitting, not consistent with previous Aboriginal structures documented in region. The next entry, 2 days later, was written in different handwriting. Foundation work proceeding on schedule, no complications. The original foreman's name disappeared from subsequent records. Of the 23 original workers, 16 vanished from all employment documentation in Victoria. No death certificates, no immigration records showing departure, no subsequent job applications, pension claims, or property transactions. The remaining 7 workers were transferred to projects in rural areas more than 200 miles from Melbourne. One of them, according to a letter preserved by his descendants, wrote to his wife describing, quote, 2, but providing no details about what those complications involved. He returned to Melbourne once in 1856, stayed 3 days, and told his family he could not discuss his work. He died in 1891 in a mining settlement in Queensland. His death certificate listed his occupation as, quote, 3, with employment dates spanning 37 years for an employer whose name was recorded as, quote, 4, an entity that appears in no government records. I started checking other cities. The chronology repeated with disturbing exactness. Buenos Aires, 1862. Foundation excavation for the Teatro Colón encounters tiled flooring 18 feet below street level. Tiles show industrial manufacture, standardized dimensions, installation precision, suggesting machine-aided placement. The work predates accepted ceramic production capabilities in the region by decades. Within 3 days, the excavation crew of 19 is reduced to 4. The 4 remaining workers are reassigned to port construction projects. The 15 who disappeared show no subsequent records anywhere in Argentina. Sacramento, 1856. The same year as the San Francisco ledger I'd found first. A theater foundation dig uncovers stone channels at 12 feet depth. The channels are carved from single pieces of granite, joints fitted without visible seams, showing engineering sophistication that the frontier city supposedly lacked. The foreman notes in his log that the channels appear functional, with evidence of recent water flow, despite burial depth. 5 days later, his employment terminates. The notation reads simply, resigned, but no resignation letter exists in the archives, and the foreman, Jonathan Kemp, never appears in employment records again. His wife's correspondence, preserved in a historical society collection, indicates he, quote, 7, quote, in May 1856, and sent 2 letters over the following year before communication ceased entirely. Montreal, 1869. Opera House Foundation work encounters what the initial foreman report describes as quote, _8 _. The space is accessed through a collapsed section of ceiling. Inside, according to the report, the workers find quote, _9 _. The report was filed on a Monday. By Friday, the entire crew of 21 had been replaced. The replacement crew's first action, documented in municipal building permits amended after the fact, was to fill the space with concrete and proceed as if it had never been opened. Irkutsk, 1867. Construction of a municipal theater in a city established as a Siberian trading post encounters metal piping systems during foundation excavation. The pipes show industrial threading, standardized connections, metallurgic composition suggesting European manufacture. The discovery occurs in May. The foreman's report to municipal authorities is dated May 12th. The response from the city building department is dated May 10th, 2 days before the report it's responding to was supposedly written. The response includes crew reassignment orders, materials disposal instructions, and a revised excavation plan avoiding the depths where the piping was found. Of the original 23 workers, 19 disappear from all subsequent documentation. 4 are transferred to projects in remote territories. The pattern was impossible to ignore. 6 continents, 4 decades, hundreds of construction projects. And in every case where foundation excavation encountered pre-existing materials that contradicted the official settlement chronology, workers vanished from the historical record within days of the discovery. The question becomes unavoidable. Where did the workers go? Not the materials they found, though their removal presents its own mysteries. Not the official explanations offered when families inquired, though those explanations collapsed under examination. Where did the men who saw what was buried go? The timeline of these disappearances reveals its own disturbing pattern. In Melbourne, 1854, excavation crew reports finding brick-lined passages on Monday. By Thursday, 8 workers are missing from payroll. In Buenos Aires, 1862, foundation diggers encountered tiled floors 16 feet down on a Tuesday. Saturday's records show the entire crew replaced with workers from a different contracting company. 3 days. The speed defies the communication infrastructure of the period. Melbourne in 1854 had no telegraph connection to other Australian cities. Messages to Sydney required 3 days by horse and ship. Communications to government offices in Britain required months. Yet the response to the discovery appeared within 72 hours. New workers arrived. Municipal building permits were amended. Supervisory personnel changed. The coordination required to execute these changes should have been impossible with the available technology. Buenos Aires presents an even more compressed timeline. The discovery occurs on Tuesday, March 18, 1862. The original crew works Wednesday and Thursday with reduced numbers. By Friday, replacement workers are on site with different tools, different supervisors, and revised excavation plans that avoid the depths where the tiles were found. The replacement crew completed the foundation work in 6 weeks. The original crew had projected 4 months for the same scope. Where did the replacement workers come from? Employment records, when they survived, show no prior history. They appear in a city's documentation for a single project, work with unusual efficiency, then vanish as completely as the crews they replaced. In Sacramento, replacement workers who arrived within days of the original crew's disappearance are listed in payroll records with no residential addresses, no previous employers, no family members registered in city directories. They existed only as names on timesheets for the duration of a single construction project. We're told that frontier administration was chaotic, disorganized, overwhelmed by rapid growth. Municipal governments struggled to maintain basic services, let alone coordinate complex personnel changes across multiple departments. But chaos doesn't produce precision. The response to these discoveries was surgical. Specific workers removed, specific depths avoided in revised plans, specific supervisory changes implemented, all within timeframes that shouldn't be achievable even with modern communications. The coordination extends beyond individual cities. In 1867, 3 separate construction projects in 3 separate countries encountered similar materials during the same 2-month window. Irkutsk discovered metal piping in May. Montreal uncovered a vaulted space in June. San Francisco found stone channels in July. In each case, the administrative response followed an identical pattern. Original crews disappeared or were transferred. Replacement workers appeared immediately. Building permits were amended to show revised excavation depths. The similarity of response across such distances, with no documented communication between the cities, presents a coordination problem that conventional explanations cannot resolve. Some of these records show responses arriving before the problems they address were officially reported. The Irkutsk Building Department response, dated 2 days before the foreman's discovery report, is not an isolated anomaly. A Melbourne municipal file contains correspondence about _10_ dated 5 days before excavation reached the depth where the brick passages were encountered. A Buenos Aires permit amendment restricting excavation depth is dated 3 weeks before workers found the tiled floor that supposedly triggered the restriction. The administrative foreknowledge is unmistakable. Someone knew what would be found before excavation began. The response wasn't reactive, it was prepared. Employment records show another impossibility. The replacement crews weren't locally sourced. In cities separated by thousands of miles of ocean, replacement workers appear within days of the original crew's disappearance. Montreal's replacement crew in 1869 includes workers whose names appear in Sacramento records from 1856 and Buenos Aires records from 1863. The travel time between these cities by available transportation methods measured in weeks or months, not days. Yet the same individuals appear in multiple locations within timeframes that make their presence impossible unless they possess transportation capabilities not documented in the historical record. Municipal budgets offer no explanation for how these operations were funded. Frontier cities operated on thin margins. Building projects were financed through local bonds, private investment, or territorial appropriations, all subject to public accounting. Yet the response to excavation discoveries involved expenses that appear nowhere in municipal ledgers. Replacement workers were paid, but not from project budgets. Materials were removed and transported, but no hauling contracts were issued. Supervisory personnel appeared, but no salaries were allocated. The financial mechanisms supporting these operations left no documentary trace. The pattern holds across decades. From the earliest discoveries in the 1850s through the last documented cases in the late 1880s, the response time remained constant, 48 to 72 hours from discovery to crew disappearance. This consistency across improving communication technology is itself revealing. As telegraph lines expanded, as rail networks connected cities, as postal services became more reliable, the response time didn't decrease. It remained fixed, suggesting the coordination mechanism predated these technological improvements and operated independently of them. The speed betrays foreknowledge. Someone knew what would be found before excavation began and had prepared the response before workers struck their shovels into earth. This presents a coordination problem. The replacement crews weren't general laborers. Employment records, where they exist, describe them with peculiar specificity. Quote 11, quote 12, quote 13. These are not terms frontier cities would use for foundation diggers. These are specialists. The language itself reveals the impossibility. Frontier construction employed miners, rail workers, general laborers willing to excavate for daily wages. Job postings from the period advertise for quote 14 or quote 15. They don't specify training in artifact preservation or historical material documentation. Those categories didn't exist in common employment vocabularies. Archaeological excavation as a professional discipline wasn't formalized until the late 19th century. Yet hiring documents from the 1850s and 1860s used terminology that wouldn't enter standard usage for another generation. Where did this vocabulary come from? More importantly, where did the expertise it describes originate? A hiring notice preserved in a Buenos Aires municipal file from 1862 requests workers quote 16 underscore. Another from Montreal, 1869, seeks laborers. A Sacramento document from 1856 specifies need for workers who can. The phrasing is consistent across continents, across decades, as if drawn from a common institutional template. The replacement workers demonstrate skills that support these unusual job descriptions. They work faster than the original crews despite encountering the same obstructions. They remove materials without damaging them, suggesting training in careful extraction rather than the expedient demolition typical of construction work. They operate with equipment that doesn't appear in standard construction inventories. Reinforced transport crates, preservation materials, documentation tools that suggest systematic cataloging rather than simple disposal. We're told these discoveries were unexpected, that cities responded to unforeseen complications with available resources. But you don't train specialists for unexpected problems. You don't develop expertise in handling materials that officially don't exist. The presence of workers specifically qualified to process archaeological anomalies indicates institutional preparation for exactly what was supposedly never anticipated. The same names recur across projects separated by vast distances and significant time. A worker listed as Thomas Whitmore, specialized extraction, appears in Montreal Opera House employment records from 1869. The same name, with the same job description, appears in Buenos Aires Theater Foundation documents from 1863. 6 years earlier, a Thomas Whitmore is listed in San Francisco construction records from 1857, again described as specialized in extraction work. The travel required to move between these projects would consume months. Ship passage from San Francisco to Buenos Aires took 6 to 8 weeks in favorable conditions. Yet the documentation suggests continuous employment with gaps of only weeks between projects thousands of miles apart. Other names follow similar patterns. James Hendricks, material documentation appears in records from Melbourne, 1854, Sacramento, 1858, and Irkutsk, 1867. Robert Morrison, preservation specialist, shows up in Buenos Aires, 1862, Montreal, 1869, and Portland, 1873. The repetition suggests a mobile workforce, specialists deployed to sites as needed, operating with coordination that transcended national boundaries and contemporary communication limitations. These workers left no other traces. No immigration records document their arrivals or departures. No census data captures their presence in the cities where they worked. No property records show where they lived. No family registrations indicate wives or children. They existed only in employment documents for specific construction projects, appearing precisely when needed and vanishing when their work concluded. The equipment they used raises additional questions. Construction sites from this period use standard tools: shovels, picks, wheelbarrows, timber supports. The replacement crews brought specialized apparatus. Municipal records reference custom extraction frames, preservation crating, and documentation equipment without describing what these items actually were. The terminology suggests technical sophistication beyond typical construction needs. Where were these tools manufactured? Who designed them? What institutional knowledge informed their specifications? No supply records document the equipment's origin. No invoices show purchases from tool manufacturers. No shipping manifests track their transport to construction sites. The specialized apparatus appears when needed and disappears with the crews who used it, leaving no procurement trail that would explain how frontier cities acquired materials designed for tasks that supposedly never occurred. The pattern of expertise deployment indicates something larger than local problem solving. This wasn't improvisation. It was procedure, refined and repeating, supported by training infrastructure and equipment supply chains that operated invisibly behind official documentation. The expertise isn't emerging from frontier conditions. It's being deployed from an established source with resources, training capacity, and coordination mechanisms that the official historical record doesn't acknowledge. What were they removing? A handful of foreman notes survived, tucked into personal correspondence. Preserved in estate sales. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. Stone-lined channels with precision-fitted joints. Ceramic piping systems showing industrial manufacture. Foundations extending to depths that suggest multi-story structures buried deliberately. Metal fixtures showing wear patterns from decades or centuries of use. And in 3 separate cities, 2,000 miles apart, references to the same discovery. Underground spaces with vaulted ceilings, still intact. The materials described don't match what frontier excavation should encounter. Virgin territory produces bedrock, clay, glacial deposits, perhaps indigenous artifacts consistent with the region's documented inhabitants. It doesn't produce industrial ceramics with standardized threading. It doesn't yield cut stone fitted without mortar and techniques associated with European masonry traditions. It doesn't contain metal piping systems requiring manufacturing capabilities these cities supposedly lacked. A letter from foreman Jonathan Kemp to his wife, dated April 1856, describes what his crew found beneath the Sacramento theater site. Found a passage today, Mary. Stonework finer than the new State House. Goes back under the hill. No telling how far. Bosses shut down the dig. Brought in different men. Asked me to sign paper saying we hit bedrock. I did not. Kemp's employment ended the following week. His wife's subsequent letters indicate he went east on contract work, with no specifics about location or employer. He never returned to Sacramento. His death certificate, filed in Alaska Territory in 1897, lists 41 years of contracted labor with no employer named. The stonework Kemp describes appears in other accounts. A Melbourne foreman's log from 1854 references _quote, _28, A Buenos Aires report from 1862 describes _quote, _29, The consistency of description across continents is striking. Different workers, different languages, different cultural backgrounds, yet the materials they encounter share specific characteristics: precision manufacturing, sophisticated installation techniques, preservation quality inconsistent with burial duration. The depth of these discoveries follows a pattern. Most materials appear between 12 and 25 feet below the established ground level of cities founded in the 1800s. This depth range is significant. It's too deep for natural accumulation from a single generation of construction. Soil builds gradually. Archaeological deposits form in thin layers over centuries. Finding finished architecture at 20 feet depth in a city supposedly 30 years old suggests either the official founding date is incorrect or the structures predate the acknowledged settlement by a considerable margin. Some foreman notes describe materials in better condition than contemporary construction. The Buenos Aires tiles showed no weathering. The Melbourne brickwork demonstrated no degradation from moisture exposure. A Montreal report describes vaulted ceiling spaces showing no structural compromise despite burial, stones as fitted as day of installation. These aren't ancient ruins in the archaeological sense. They're preserved infrastructure that somehow remained intact through whatever process buried it beneath 15 feet of earth. Worker testimony, rare and preserved only in private letters, emphasizes this quality preservation. One letter from a Melbourne excavation worker to his brother describes the brick passages as looking newer than what we were building above it, as if buried yesterday rather than generations past. A Sacramento worker's diary entry notes that metal fixtures discovered at depth _quote, 32 underscore. The discoveries show planning rather than accident. Stone channels run in deliberate directions. Ceramic pipes connect in systematic networks. The vaulted spaces described in Montreal, San Francisco, and Irkutsk aren't random cavities. They're finished architectural features, curved ceilings, shaped walls, evidence of intentional design and skilled construction. These are components of larger systems. Infrastructure built with purpose and maintained until whatever event buried it. 3 separate Foreman reports reference inscriptions or symbols on discovered materials. None describe what these markings depicted. The Montreal report mentions, quote, 33 on stones within the vaulted space. A Buenos Aires document references, quote, 34 on ceramic pipes. An Irkutsk log notes, quote, 35, quote, on metal fixtures. In each case, the description ends there. No sketches were preserved, no detailed descriptions survived. The replacement crews, when they arrived, removed these materials first. Why bury functional spaces? Why cover intact structures with earth? Natural disaster doesn't produce uniform burial across multiple continents. Flooding leaves sediment patterns. Volcanic activity creates ash layers. Earthquake damage shows structural collapse. But the materials workers discovered weren't collapsed. They were preserved, sealed, as if someone methodically covered working infrastructure with soil, creating new ground level above what had existed before. These weren't scattered artifacts or isolated ruins. The Foreman descriptions indicate connected systems extending beyond excavation boundaries. Passages that go back under the hill, no telling how far. Pipe networks that continue in multiple directions from excavation point. Spaces that suggest structures of considerable extent beyond accessed area. The discoveries represent portions of larger infrastructure glimpsed briefly during foundation work before removal and concealment. Around 1890, something changed. Construction projects after this date show different patterns. Foundation excavations proceed without incident. Employment records remain complete. Workers stay employed, and the discoveries, when materials are encountered, no longer trigger coordinated responses. The shift is abrupt rather than gradual. Projects from 1888 and 1889 still show the familiar pattern. Anomalous materials discovered, crews disappearing, replacement workers arriving within days. Then, in 1891, a Chicago construction project uncovers ceramic piping during foundation work for a commercial building. The discovery is documented in the project foreman's official report. The materials are photographed, cataloged, and donated to the Field Museum as examples of pre-Columbian infrastructure. The excavation crew remains employed through project completion. No workers vanish. No administrative intervention occurs. The change appears across multiple cities within a narrow time frame. A San Francisco project in 1895, following the earthquake damage that required extensive foundation repairs, encounters worked stone at significant depth. The discovery becomes part of the public record. Newspapers report on the finding. Local historians examine the materials. The stones are preserved as curiosities, labeled as remnants of quote underscore 39 underscore, and no attempt is made to suppress the information or remove the workers who found them. Projects after 1890 either find nothing unusual or handle discoveries conventionally. The urgent secrecy that characterized responses for 4 decades simply ceases. Materials that would have triggered crew disappearances in 1885 are treated as routine archaeological findings in 1895. The institutional machinery that had operated with such precision across continents appears to have been dismantled or rendered unnecessary. Building practices shift during this same period in ways that avoid the depths where earlier discoveries occurred. Construction projects from the 1850s through 1880s regularly excavated to 15 or 20 feet for foundation work, citing bedrock requirements and structural stability. Projects after 1890 rarely excavate beyond 10 or 12 feet, despite building larger, heavier structures that should require deeper foundations. The engineering explanations cite improved construction techniques and better materials. But the effect is to avoid the depth range where problematic materials had been consistently encountered. Architectural journals from the 1890s show this trend explicitly. Articles discuss quote underscore 40 underscore that achieve structural integrity with shallower excavation. The justifications focus on efficiency and cost savings. No mention is made of the decades of deeper excavation that preceded this shift, or why structures built with supposedly inferior techniques required greater depth. The change correlates precisely with the cessation of discovery-related complications, suggesting the engineering justifications serve to rationalize avoiding depths that might still contain inconvenient evidence. The systematic nature of pre-1890 removals becomes clear when examining what later projects don't find. Cities where earlier excavations encountered extensive underground infrastructure should show some remaining traces. Passages extend beyond excavation boundaries. Pipe networks continue in multiple directions. Vaulted spaces suggest larger complexes. Yet post-1890 projects in these same cities encounter nothing. The materials removed between 1850 and 1890 appear to have been comprehensive. Whatever existed beneath these cities was extracted systematically during that 40-year window. By 1895, the need for secrecy had ended because the evidence was already gone. I reached out to institutional archaeologists, municipal historians, construction archive specialists. I asked simple questions. Where did the workers go? What happened to materials removed from sites? Why do employment records show systematic gaps? The silence was overwhelming. Not hostility, not defensiveness, just careful disinterest, as if the questions themselves were inappropriate. University archaeology departments responded to initial inquiries with form letters acknowledging receipt, but providing no substantive engagement. Follow-up requests went unanswered. When I cited specific foreman testimonies and asked about their historical interpretation, the responses cited workload constraints, lack of expertise in that particular period, or suggestions to contact other institutions that subsequently proved equally unresponsive. Municipal archives acknowledged gaps in employment records but offered no explanations. A query to Melbourne's City Archives about the 1854 Theatre Foundation workers received a response noting that _41_ no investigation into why gaps appeared specifically at points of documented discoveries was considered warranted. The incompleteness was treated as self-explanatory, requiring no further examination. Freedom of information requests produced similar deflections. A request for complete employment records from Sacramento construction projects between 1855 and 1860 was denied on privacy grounds, despite the subjects being deceased for over a century. The denial letter cited regulations protecting personal information, without addressing how century-old records of missing workers could pose privacy concerns. An appeal explaining the historical research purpose received no response. Historical societies proved equally evasive. Several possess materials donated by descendants of missing workers, letters and personal effects preserved by families, hoping for information about their ancestors' fates. These collections are listed in catalogs as restricted or assigned to special collections with access requiring permissions that are never granted. One archivist, in an unguarded moment during a phone conversation, acknowledged that, "We know there are sensitive items in those donations, but we're not authorized to discuss the nature of the sensitivity or the restrictions' origins." Museum collections show similar patterns. Materials recovered from 19th century construction sites appear in acquisition records, but aren't available for research. A query to a Western Regional Museum about ceramic pipes cataloged as _45 received a response stating the items were _46. A status check 3 years later received the same response. Verbatim, the items remain in permanent conservation limbo, perpetually unavailable. Academic journals show no interest in the pattern. Submissions detailing the coordinated disappearances and suggesting avenues for investigation were declined without peer review. Rejection notices cited _47, or _48. One editor's response was more direct. While the employment record gaps you describe may be intriguing, they don't constitute evidence of the historical revisionism you're suggesting. Absence of documentation is not documentation of absence. The logical contortion required to dismiss systematic patterns across continents as mere administrative oversight went unremarked. Professional archaeologists declined interviews. Those willing to engage initially became unavailable after consulting with supervisors or institutional review boards. One researcher at a major university agreed to examine the form and testimonies I'd collected. After a week, she sent a brief email. Quote 50. Subsequent attempts to contact her received no response. The pattern extends to contemporary construction. Inquiries to engineering firms about why modern foundation depths rarely exceed 10 to 12 feet, despite larger building loads. Received technical explanations about improved materials and design efficiency. When I asked whether avoiding deeper excavation might relate to materials encountered in historical projects, the conversations ended quickly. One structural engineer admitted off the record that, quote, 51, the silence isn't uniform refusal. It's coordinated discretion. Individual archivists, researchers, and officials respond politely, acknowledge the questions, and then cite reasons why they specifically cannot engage. The effect is deflection without confrontation, a distributed system of non-response that avoids appearing coordinated while achieving perfect consistency. The question isn't whether evidence exists. It's whether examination is permitted. Employment ledgers with gaps are evidence. Foreman testimonies describing discoveries are evidence. The 40-year pattern of worker disappearances across continents is evidence. But institutional scholarship treats this evidence as irrelevant, its patterns as coincidental, and inquiries into its meaning as inappropriate. The few documents that escaped institutional control reveal something specific. Letters between family members, diary entries from wives and children, probate records from estates settled decades later. The workers didn't die, they were relocated, and they were prevented from returning. A letter preserved in a private family collection, written by an excavation worker to his sister in 1857, describes his situation with careful vagueness. I'm under contract for work I cannot describe, in a location I cannot name. The pay exceeds what Sacramento offered, and I am told the arrangement is temporary, though no end date was specified. Please assure Margaret I am well, though I cannot say when I will return. The letter is postmarked from Alaska Territory. The worker, David Preston, had been listed on the Sacramento Theater Foundation crew roster until May 1856. His employment record shows termination without cause. This letter, dated 14 months later, is the only documentation of his continued existence. Family testimonies follow similar patterns. Wives describe husbands leaving for contract work, with promises of return that never materialized. Initial letters would arrive with money, but no details about location or employment nature. Then correspondence would cease. Some families received notification of death decades later, often from remote territories. Northern Canada, Alaska, isolated mining districts in the American West. The death certificates list contracted labor as occupation, spanning 20, 30, even 40 years from the point of disappearance. A probate filing from Alaska Territory in 1903 provides unusual detail. The estate of Michael Donovan, listed as born Ireland 1831, died Alaska 1903. Employment history. Contracted labor, 1856 to 1903. Residence, a remote supply post with no mining or resource extraction operations, documented in territorial records. Estate value, $4,720, a substantial sum for a laborer, representing 47 years of accumulated wages. Source of funds, employment contract fulfillment, annuity. The next of kin, a daughter in Sacramento who last saw her father in April 1856. Michael Donovan appears on the Sacramento Theater Foundation crew roster, listed as terminated May 1856 with no details. Other probate records show similar patterns. Workers who vanished in the 1850s and 1860s, leaving families without explanation, died in remote locations decades later, with accumulated wealth suggesting continuous employment. The death certificates specify long-term contracted labor, but never name employers. The locations are consistently isolated. Territories with minimal population, areas difficult to reach, places where outsiders would be noticed and remembered, yet where no one recalls these long-term residents. Some workers attempted return and were prevented. A letter from a Melbourne worker's wife, dated 1862, describes her husband appearing briefly at their home under escort of quote, _57_. He stayed one night, refused to discuss his work or location, and departed the next morning. She never saw him again. His death certificate filed in northern Queensland 35 years later, indicates he died within 50 miles of Melbourne, but made no further contact with his family during those decades. Court records from several cities show families petitioning for information about missing workers. The petitions were denied on grounds that the workers had entered into, quote, 58, quote, that superseded family claims. One San Francisco court ruling from 1861 states explicitly that workers who sign certain types of labor contracts forfeit, quote, 59, quote, for the contract duration. The ruling doesn't specify what labor would require such restrictions or why courts would enforce them. The contracts themselves don't survive in accessible archives. References to them appear in court documents, estate settlements, and occasional administrative correspondence, but the actual agreements are never produced. The few descriptions indicate unusual terms: no specified end date, restrictions on disclosure, requirements for isolation from previous communities, and provisions for lifelong financial support in exchange for compliance. What did they see that required silence for their entire remaining lives? The discoveries described in foreman notes show infrastructure that contradicted official chronologies. Workers encountered evidence of pre-existing civilization during excavations in cities supposedly built on virgin land. The response was to remove both the evidence and the witnesses, not through elimination but through isolation and financial incentive. They were bought, relocated to places where they couldn't casually reveal what they'd found, provided with income sufficient to make compliance worthwhile, and maintained in isolation until natural death removed the last witnesses to what lay beneath the cities. Let me be precise about what we're examining here. Between approximately 1850 and 1890, construction projects across 6 continents experienced a coordinated pattern of worker disappearances. This occurred specifically among excavation crews who encountered materials that contradicted the official timeline of settlement. The disappearances happened within 48 to 72 hours of discoveries. Replacement crews with specialized expertise appeared immediately, despite frontier communication limitations. The materials removed included infrastructure showing technological sophistication that supposedly didn't exist in those locations. The documentation of these events was systematically purged from official records. Workers who disappeared were relocated to remote territories and maintained in isolation for decades. And precisely where documentation should illuminate these events, we find erasure. The conventional explanation requires us to believe in remarkable coincidences, that dozens of cities independently decided foundation work required immediate crew replacements when specific materials were encountered, that specialized workers with training in historical artifact processing appeared within days in frontier locations lacking the educational infrastructure to produce such expertise, that administrative responses coordinated across sovereign nations with communication requiring weeks or months somehow occurred within 72 hours, that employment records developed systematic gaps precisely at points of documented discoveries through unrelated archival losses, that workers who saw these materials voluntarily relocated to remote territories, accepted lifelong isolation, and maintained complete silence about their discoveries until death. We're expected to believe that foremen independently used identical terminology to describe materials across continents without communication, that replacement crews worked faster than original crews despite encountering the same obstructions, that municipal building departments issued responses to discovery reports before the reports were written, that the same workers appeared in multiple cities thousands of miles apart within timeframes impossible with documented transportation, that specialized equipment designed for non-existent problems somehow existed and was deployed systematically, that families accepted permanent separation from workers without investigation or legal challenge. The explanation requires accepting that materials showing industrial manufacture appeared at significant depth in virgin territory through processes that leave no geological trace, that ceramic pipes with standardized threading, cut stone with precision fitting, and metal fixtures with wear patterns predating official settlement somehow emerged naturally or represent misidentified indigenous artifacts despite bearing no resemblance to documented indigenous construction methods. That vaulted architectural spaces found sealed and intact at burial depths consistent with deliberate covering represent random geological formations rather than human construction. We're asked to believe that the 40-year pattern of discoveries and disappearances ceased abruptly in 1890 through coincidence rather than project completion. That modern construction avoids depths where historical discoveries occurred for unrelated engineering reasons. That institutional archives independently refuse to investigate obvious patterns in employment records across multiple countries and time periods. That contemporary reluctance to discuss historical foundation complications represents professional disinterest rather than continuing restriction. The pattern requires accepting that century-old probate records showing lifelong contracted labor in remote locations with unnamed employers and substantial accumulated wages represent conventional employment rather than witness management. That court rulings enforcing labor contracts requiring isolation and communication restrictions applied to ordinary construction work. That families receiving death certificates decades after disappearances from territories where no one remembers the deceased workers never pursued investigation. How many coordinated anomalies before we're obligated to consider alternative explanations? How many impossible timelines before we question the official chronology? How many systematic documentation gaps before we recognize deliberate suppression? How many specialized responses to supposedly unexpected problems before we acknowledge institutional foreknowledge? How many workers maintained in isolation until death before we understand what they witnessed required permanent silence? The explanation requiring the fewest impossible assumptions is the one institutional scholarship refuses to examine. These cities weren't built on virgin land. They were built over existing infrastructure from a civilization that preceded the official founding dates. The excavation discoveries represented exposure of that earlier construction. The worker disappearances represented witness control. The specialized crews represented an institutional capacity to respond to discoveries that shouldn't surprise anyone who knew what actually lay beneath these cities. And the 40-year pattern represented systematic removal of evidence before the earlier civilization's existence became undeniable. How many coincidences before pattern becomes evidence? A preserved photograph that wasn't meant to survive shows a construction site in 1886. The image quality is poor, the exposure uneven, clearly not a professional documentation shot. But it captures something specific. Workers in the foreground are pouring concrete over what appears to be older stonework. The stones are visible in the frame precisely cut, fitted without mortar, showing none of the weathering that exposure would produce. In the background, other workers are loading crates onto a wagon. The photograph was found in an estate sale, marked on the back. Portland Foundation work, March 1886. Destroyed negatives as ordered. The notation is evidence itself. Someone documented the work, then received orders to destroy that documentation. This photograph survived accidentally, preserved in personal effects rather than official archives. The stonework visible in the frame matches descriptions from foreman notes, precision fitting, sophisticated construction techniques, material quality exceeding contemporary standards. The workers covering it aren't excavating, they're concealing. Portland was officially established in 1845. This photograph from 41 years later shows infrastructure being deliberately buried beneath new construction. The stones aren't being removed, they're being encased, hidden under concrete foundations that will support the visible city while ensuring what lies beneath remains inaccessible to future excavation. The crates in the background suggest simultaneous operations. Some materials were covered, others were removed entirely. The systematic nature of the work is evident even in this single frame. This wasn't damage control responding to unexpected discovery. This was planned operation, methodical and thorough. The order itself is evidence. Quote, 61 indicates policy rather than isolated decision. Someone had authority to order documentation destruction across construction sites. The phrasing suggests routine compliance rather than exceptional request. How many other photographs were destroyed? How many other sites were documented before evidence was systematically erased? The stonework wasn't being excavated, it was being erased. And someone wanted no record of what was being removed. I didn't start this investigation believing in suppressed history or coordinated cover-ups. I found employment records with unexplained gaps and followed the pattern wherever it led. It led here to a coordinated effort spanning decades and continents to remove evidence of pre-existing civilization, silence the workers who discovered it, and ensure that subsequent generations would accept the official chronology without question. These weren't random disappearances. They were surgical removals of witnesses. Workers encountered infrastructure that contradicted the narrative of cities built on virgin land, and within 72 hours, those workers vanished from the historical record. Not killed because bodies create questions, relocated because isolation ensures silence, maintained for decades in remote territories because the discoveries they witnessed required suppression for entire lifetimes. The scale reveals institutional coordination that transcended national boundaries. The same response pattern in Australia, South America, Siberia, and North America. The same specialized crews appearing within impossible timeframes. The same administrative foreknowledge producing responses before discoveries were reported. The same systematic purging of documentation across independent municipal archives. This wasn't local problem solving. This was centralized operation with resources, authority, and reach that shouldn't exist in the fragmented political landscape of the 19th century. What knowledge did these buried structures represent? Who possessed the authority to coordinate evidence suppression across sovereign nations? What came before the official founding dates of these cities? Where did the materials removed from hundreds of excavation sites go? How many other discovery types triggered similar responses we haven't yet identified? What else was removed from historical memory before we knew to look for it? The employment ledgers remain incomplete and unexplained. The workers vanished into remote territories and silence. The materials removed from beneath frontier cities went somewhere, processed by someone, for purposes we're not permitted to investigate. And the buildings above ground stand as monuments to what was stolen, not from the earth, but from historical memory. What else did we inherit without knowing what came before? And what else was taken from us before we even knew it had existed? The excavation crews kept vanishing because they saw what we weren't supposed to see, and someone made very sure they'd never tell.